Jason, 15, thought staying home alone while his parents and sister were away in Texas would be a dream: unlimited movies, junk food, and no rules. But one stormy Friday night turned that excitement into a living nightmare. The rain pounded against the windows as Jason wrapped up a day of gaming and chatting with friends. By 11 p.m., he slipped under the covers, listening to the steady rhythm of raindrops tapping on the glass. Just as sleep began to take hold, a sound from downstairs snapped him awake. It was faint but unmistakable: someone was talking. At first, he brushed it off, thinking his family had come back early. But they weren't due home until Monday. His pulse quickened as he sat up in bed, straining to hear. The voice was still there, distant and muffled. Curiosity overpowered his fear, and he climbed out of bed. He eased his bedroom door open just enough to peek into the dim hallway. The house was deathly quiet, aside from that eerie murmur drifting up from below. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to move, taking slow, careful steps down the stairs. At the bottom, he froze, listening intently. The voice was clearer now, but the words were unintelligible. It was coming from the living room. Summoning his courage, he inched forward. Then, bang! A door slammed, the sound ricocheting through the house. Jason's breath hitched as he whipped his head toward the hallway. His blood ran cold. A figure loomed at the end of the corridor. Tall. Dressed in black. Motionless. The shadows obscured his face, but Jason knew he wasn't alone. A strangled gasp escaped him as he stumbled back. Who was this man? How had he gotten inside? Panic took over. Jason spun on his heel and bolted up the stairs, heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, footsteps echoed, fast and heavy. He barely made it to his room before slamming the door and locking it. Hands trembling, he fumbled for his phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and words tumbled from Jason's lips in a frantic rush. She assured him help was coming and urged him to stay on the line. Downstairs, the intruder moved, slow, deliberate steps. Jason clutched the phone, barely breathing. Then, sirens. The footsteps halted. Silence. Minutes later, a firm knock rattled the front door. Voices, authoritative, commanding. The police. Still shaking, Jason crept out of his room and down the stairs, his legs like jelly. 2 officers stood in the dimly lit hallway, flashlights slicing through the darkness. He recounted everything, his voice unsteady. They searched the house thoroughly. Nothing. No forced entry. No signs of anyone. It was as if the man had simply vanished. The officers advised Jason to stay with a neighbor, but he refused to leave. They promised to keep watch and left him their contact information. Alone again, Jason couldn't shake the lingering terror. Who was the shadowy figure? What had he wanted? The questions swirled in his mind, but no answers came. He spent the rest of the night rigid with fear, every sound sending his heart into overdrive. Morning brought some relief, but the memory of that night was burned into his mind. When his parents returned, they were horrified. They installed a security system, double-checking every lock. The police kept investigating, but no clues surfaced. Whoever, or whatever, had stood in Jason's hallway that night was never found. But Jason knew one thing for certain. He would never sleep soundly in that house again. Before we get into the next story, if you're here for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. Next video. When I was 37, I decided to attend my high school reunion. It had been years since I'd set foot in my hometown, so I flew into the nearest airport, rented a car, and started the 35-mile drive back. The road wound through empty fields and dense woods, an isolated stretch of countryside that felt almost forgotten. As I drove through that quiet, eerie landscape, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that I was stepping into a place frozen in time. About 3 miles outside of town, I spotted someone standing by the side of the road, waving me down. As I slowed the car, my stomach did a little flip. I recognized him. It was Jim, an old friend from high school. We hadn't seen each other in 20 years, but he looked nearly the same, just a little older, as if time had barely touched him. Jim slid into the passenger seat, and just like that, we fell into easy conversation. We reminisced about our high school days, laughing over the dumb pranks we'd pulled and the wild nights we thought would last forever. It felt good, familiar. Like the years had never passed. As we neared town, I asked if he wanted to grab a drink at the VFW with me. "No, just take me home," he said. I figured he still lived near his parents' old house, a few blocks from where my grandmother used to live, so I started heading in that direction. But Jim shook his head. "Take me to the outskirts of town," he said. I knew there was a trailer park out that way, so I assumed that's where he lived now. When we reached the turnoff, he unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to me. "Just drop me here. It was good to see you again." Then, without another word, he stepped out of the car and walked off into the darkness. I didn't think much of it at the time. I continued on to the VFW, where I met up with old classmates. We caught up, joked around, and talked about who was making it to the reunion. At some point, I casually mentioned picking up Jim on the way into town. The room went dead silent. Even the guy doing karaoke stopped singing and put the mic down. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I looked around at their faces. My cousin, sitting next to me, had gone pale. "Barb," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jim died on that curve 8 years ago. Rolled his car. We were all at his funeral." My stomach clenched. I felt the blood drain from my face. I shook my head, my mind scrambling for an explanation. "That's not possible," I muttered. "I just saw him. He was in my car." But the looks on their faces told me they weren't joking. I needed air. I pushed back from the table and walked outside, gulping in deep breaths as I leaned against my car. My hands were shaking. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Then I saw something on the passenger seat. A newspaper. I picked it up with trembling fingers, and when I unfolded it, my heart nearly stopped. It was old, yellowed with time. The date on the front page was from 8 years ago. Right there, staring back at me, was Jim's obituary. The article detailed how he had lost control of his car on that very stretch of road and rolled into a ditch. He had died on impact. My breath hitched in my throat. My vision blurred. I had just seen him. Talked to him. Given him a ride. How was this possible? I barely slept that night. The next morning, I had to know more. I drove to Jim's parents' house and knocked on the door. His mother answered, her eyes weary with grief. I introduced myself and hesitated for a moment before telling her what had happened. She didn't look surprised. Instead, she sighed and stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. Over a cup of coffee, she told me I wasn't the first. Over the years, several people had claimed to have seen Jim, always near the place where he had crashed. Some thought it was just tricks of the mind, but others believed his spirit was still lingering. "I still feel him here sometimes," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I hear his favorite song play on the radio when the power's out. Sometimes, I wake up at night and swear I hear his footsteps in the hall." A cold shiver ran through me. I left Jim's house feeling a strange mix of sadness and disbelief. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I kept replaying our conversation in my head. Why had he appeared to me? Had he needed something? Was there something left unfinished? A few days later, I packed up and headed home. As I passed the spot where I had picked Jim up, I slowed the car. The road was empty, but I felt it, that same eerie sensation crawling over my skin. To this day, I still have that newspaper with Jim's obituary. I keep it as proof that what happened that night was real. Whenever I think about it, I feel a deep, lingering sense of something just beyond my understanding. Maybe Jim just wanted to say goodbye. Maybe he was looking for a way home. Or maybe, some ghosts never really leave. Next video. Camping alone in the woods had always been a dream of mine. The idea of escaping the chaos of city life and immersing myself in nature filled me with excitement. So, one Friday afternoon, I packed my tent, sleeping bag, and enough supplies to last the weekend, then drove out to the edge of the dark forest. After parking my car, I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders and began the hike deep into the trees. The sun shone warmly overhead as I made my way to a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. The towering trees swayed gently in the breeze, their rustling leaves harmonizing with the distant chirps of birds. A wave of tranquility washed over me. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, and soon had a small fire crackling before me. As daylight faded, the forest transformed. The friendly daylight sounds vanished, replaced by a haunting silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. Wrapped in my sleeping bag, I gazed up at the endless stretch of stars above, feeling simultaneously isolated and alive. Then I heard it, a rustling in the nearby bushes. My heartbeat quickened. I reassured myself it was just an animal, but the noise persisted, growing closer. My body tensed as I sat up, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glow of the fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice unsteady. Silence. Grabbing my flashlight, I aimed the beam toward the bushes. Nothing. Just swaying leaves and empty darkness. I exhaled, trying to shake the growing unease. Probably a deer. Maybe a raccoon. Still, I wasn't taking chances. I fed more wood into the fire and sat closer, hoping the flickering flames would keep any curious creatures at bay. Yet, the eerie sensation of being watched lingered, sending icy shivers up my spine. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf had my nerves on edge. Hours passed, and my body finally began to surrender to exhaustion. Just as I started crawling back into my tent, the sound of footsteps shattered the silence. Deliberate. Measured. Drawing closer. A sharp chill gripped my spine. This wasn't an animal. "Who's there?" I called out again, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Gripping a thick branch from the ground, I stood beside the fire, heart hammering against my ribs. Then, just beyond the firelight, he appeared. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, standing unervingly still. His face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel his eyes locked onto me. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to suppress the tremor in my voice. No response. Just silence. Dread coiled in my stomach. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but every instinct screamed at me to run. Moving cautiously, I backed toward my tent, never breaking eye contact. Then he moved. A sudden, swift step toward me. That was all it took. Adrenaline took control, and I bolted into the forest, the darkness swallowing me whole. Branches whipped against my skin as I ran blindly, pushing through tangled underbrush. My lungs burned, my pulse roared in my ears. Behind me, the sound of footsteps. Fast. Gaining. I stumbled over a thick root, crashing hard onto the forest floor. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to my feet, limping forward as fast as I could. In the distance, the faint glow of moonlight filtered through the trees. Then I saw it. A cabin. Lights flickering inside. With every ounce of strength, I sprinted toward it, slamming my fists against the door. "Help! Please, help me!" I cried, desperation strangling my voice. The door swung open, revealing an old man, his weathered face twisted in alarm. "What's going on?" he asked. "There's someone out there. He's chasing me." I gasped, glancing frantically over my shoulder. The man's expression hardened. Without hesitation, he pulled me inside, bolting the door behind us. My breath came in ragged gasps as I collapsed onto the floor. He peered out the window. "There's no one there," he said finally, turning back to me. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded, still trembling. He was there, watching me. The old man studied me for a moment, then sighed. "You can stay here tonight. We'll check in the morning." Wrapped in a blanket, I curled up on the couch, my body still shaking with leftover fear. The old man sat nearby, keeping watch. Despite the lingering terror, exhaustion won. My eyes drifted shut, and I slipped into a restless sleep. By morning, with the safety of daylight, we returned to my campsite. No footprints. No broken branches. No sign of anyone. But I knew what I saw. What I felt. As I packed my things, a single, chilling thought clung to me. I had gone into the forest seeking solitude. But I was never alone. Next video. Working as a nurse in a mental health facility had always been challenging, but I prided myself on staying calm under pressure. I had seen patients in distress, unpredictable outbursts, and moments of heartbreaking silence, but nothing had ever truly shaken me. Until that night. It was a quiet Thursday evening at St. Anne's mental health facility. The sun had set, and the moonlight stretched eerie shadows across the hallways. The building was old, the wooden floors groaning under every step, the narrow corridors stretching into dimly lit emptiness. Some patients were withdrawn, lost in their own minds, while others lashed out at invisible enemies. I had the night shift, starting at 8 p.m. The air was cool, the atmosphere no different from any other night. I made my rounds, ensuring the patients had taken their medications and were resting. Everything seemed in order. But something felt off. A weight in the air. A sensation of unseen eyes following me. I shook it off and returned to the nurse's station, updating records under the glow of a small desk lamp. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Indistinct. I froze, straining to listen. Silence. Shaking my head, I turned back to my work. But minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. "Emily. Emily." A chill crawled up my spine. I stood abruptly, scanning the empty hallway outside. Nothing. Trying to dismiss the growing unease, I decided to check on the patients again. The hallways were darker than usual, the flickering fluorescent lights casting unsettling shadows. I reached room 307. Mrs. Thompson. A long-term patient, mostly silent, spending her days staring out the window. Tonight was no different, except for one thing. She was humming. A slow, unfamiliar tune. The sound sent an involuntary shudder through me. "Mrs. Thompson." I called softly. She didn't acknowledge me. I stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She stopped humming. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her wide eyes gleamed under the dim moonlight. "They're here," she whispered. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's here, Mrs. Thompson?" She licked her lips, her voice barely audible. "The shadows. They come at night. They whisper. They want to take me. A cold dread settled in my stomach. The shadows. The shadows. The shadows. She repeated, rocking slightly. I left the room quickly, the unease now twisting into fear. Halfway back to the nurse's station, the hallway lights flickered. Then the whispering returned. Emily. Emily. Louder this time. I quickened my pace, my pulse hammering in my ears. The moment I reached the station, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the pitch-black corridor. The whispering escalated. Not one voice now, but many. Emily, come play with us, join us. A cold gust rushed past me, sending my papers flying from the desk. My flashlight flickered. In the corner of my vision, something moved. A shadow. Not a patient. Not a person. Something else. I sucked in a sharp breath, gripping the flashlight tighter. My hands trembled as I stumbled into the security room. I needed to see the cameras. To prove to myself that I was imagining things. The screens flickered to life. Empty hallways. Empty rooms. Then, movement. The camera outside room 307. Dark figures. Not solid. Not human. Shifting, writhing, approaching the nurse's station. Coming for me. A sharp chill gripped my spine as I stared at the screen, my breath shallow. I snatched the phone to call security. No dial tone. The whispering filled the room now, suffocating, overwhelming. Emily, join us, forever. The shadows reached the door. The air turned ice-cold. The handle began to turn. I pressed myself against the wall, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, light. Bright, blinding fluorescent light. The whispering stopped. The shadows were gone. I gasped for breath, my hands shaking violently. The rest of the night passed in a daze. Somehow, I made it through my shift, but the feeling of something lurking, something watching, never left me. When morning came, I handed off to the day nurse and walked out without looking back. I never spoke of what happened. Who would believe me? I never worked another night shift at St. Anne's. But even now, in the quiet hours of the night, when everything is still and silent, I still hear the whispering. Next video. Moving into my own apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. It was small but cozy, with soft blue walls and a large window that bathed the living room in warm sunlight. After years of sharing space with roommates, I finally had a place to call my own. That first evening, after unpacking most of my boxes, I settled onto the couch with a cup of tea and a book, letting the quiet surround me. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. It was peaceful. Until I heard it. A faint scratching at my front door. I froze, listening. It was so soft, I almost convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind. Shaking off the unease creeping into my chest, I turned back to my book. Then it came again. Louder. More deliberate. Like someone trying to unlock the door from the outside. My stomach clenched. Slowly, I set my book down and tiptoed to the door, pressing my eye against the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the dim glow of the security light flickering against the walls. I waited, my breath caught in my throat. Silence. Maybe I was imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that clung to me. I left the hallway light on and turned on the TV, hoping the background noise would drown out my paranoia. Hours passed, and eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just nerves. A new place, unfamiliar sounds. By the time I crawled into bed, I felt a little better. The blankets were warm, the apartment still and quiet. Until I woke up. It was sudden. No dream had startled me, no shift in the air. Then I heard it. The scratching. This time, it was frantic. My pulse hammered as I sat up, straining to hear. Then, the sound of my door handle jiggling. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I checked the time. 2:30 a.m. The rattling grew more aggressive. Heavy breathing. A low, muffled voice muttering something just beyond the door. Panic surged through me. I held my breath, frozen in place. I needed to do something. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The operator answered, their voice calm and steady. I whispered into the phone, describing what was happening. They told me help was on the way. Stay quiet. Stay where you are. The noise outside my door grew louder. A thud. Another rattle. Then, silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, I heard it. Sirens. The intruder must have heard them too because the noises stopped abruptly. The hallway fell silent. I stayed in bed, clutching my phone, too terrified to move. A knock at the door made me jump. Police, a voice called. Legs shaking, I forced myself to my feet and crept toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Another knock. I unbolted the lock, barely cracking the door open. Two officers stood there, their faces serious. I let them in, my voice unsteady as I explained what had happened. They searched the apartment, checked the hallway. Whoever it was, they're gone now, one of them said. But we'll stay in the area for a while, just in case. I nodded, still shaken, but grateful they were there. They stayed for about an hour, patrolling the building, ensuring everything was safe. Before leaving, they advised me to call immediately if anything happened again. I locked the door the moment they left, double-checking every window. Despite their reassurance, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building sent my heart racing. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting. For what, I didn't know. The next morning, I contacted the building manager. They promised to check the security cameras and increase hallway lighting. I bought a sturdier lock and kept a heavy flashlight by my bed. Days passed. Nothing happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every night, I heard sounds, whispers, the creak of floorboards, the faintest echo of footsteps. But whenever I checked, the hallway was empty. The police assured me the intruder was gone. But I wasn't so sure. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he wanted. And worst of all, I didn't know if he'd come back. Next video. My name is Tom, and I work as a delivery driver for a small diner called Maggie's Place. It's a simple job, pick up food, drop it off, and collect a tip. I've been doing it for months, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Until that night. The night I'll never forget. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween. A cold wind swept through the empty streets as I was finishing up my shift. I had just cleaned out my car, ready to call it a night, when the phone rang. One last order. A cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. Nothing unusual. Except for the address. Maple Avenue. I barely ever delivered there. Pulling up the map on my phone, I saw that the house was tucked away at the far end of the street, a part of town I rarely visited. I didn't think much of it. Just another order. I bagged up the food, grabbed my jacket, and hit the road. The drive was longer than expected. The further I went, the quieter the streets became. Fewer streetlights, fewer cars. The houses on Maple Avenue were old, towering over the cracked sidewalks like forgotten relics. The air felt heavier. Then, I saw it. 103, Maple Avenue. The house stood alone at the very end of the street, swallowed by shadows. The paint peeled in long, jagged strips. The windows were black voids, some cracked, others boarded up. The yard was overgrown, the front gate hanging by a single hinge. Something about it made my stomach tighten. Still, a job was a job. I pushed open the creaky gate and stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight. I knocked. The sound echoed inside. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I sighed and was about to leave when I heard it. A voice. From above. I'm coming. I looked up. A shadow shifted in the upstairs window. Finally, someone was home. I stayed on the porch, waiting, the bag of food growing heavy in my hands. But no one came down. Hello. I called out. Your food is here. Silence. I pulled out my phone and checked the address. It was correct. I dialed the number on the order slip. Straight to voicemail. The uneasy feeling in my gut twisted tighter. Then, behind me, footsteps. I spun around. An old woman stood on the sidewalk, staring at me. Her face was drawn, her eyes wide with concern. Are you looking for someone? She asked. Yeah, I replied, pointing at the house. I have a delivery for 103, but no one's answering. Her expression darkened. She shook her head slowly. No one lives there, she said. A chill crawled up my spine. Are you sure? She nodded. That house has been abandoned for years. I felt my mouth go dry. But, someone placed an order. The old woman's gaze drifted toward the upstairs window. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They say the house is haunted. People hear voices. See shadows in the windows. But no one lives there. Not since the fire. The fire? I turned back to the house, a cold unease settling into my bones. What fire? I asked. She hesitated. A family lived there, years ago. There was a fire one night. No one made it out. I swallowed hard. The porch creaked behind me. I turned. Empty. The door was still closed. The house still silent. Something deep inside me screamed to leave. I placed the bag of food on the porch, muttered a quick thanks to the old woman, and hurried back to my car. Then I heard it. Louder this time. I'm coming. I turned back. The porch was empty. The front door, still closed. The house, silent. I didn't stay to figure it out. I jumped into my car, slammed the door, and peeled out of there, my heart hammering in my chest. When I got back to the diner, Maggie took one look at my face and frowned. You okay? I told her everything. She listened quietly, then sighed. Maple Avenue, huh? I've heard stories about that place. That house has been empty for over a decade. Must have been a prank call. A prank call. I wanted to believe that. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt real. Too real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. The voice. The shadow in the window. The old woman's warning. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I did some digging. The old woman was right. 15 years ago, a fire destroyed 103 Maple Avenue. A family of 4 had lived there. None of them survived. The house had been abandoned ever since. I don't know who, or what, I encountered that night. But I never went back to Maple Avenue. And every time I hear someone say, "I'm coming," I remember that voice. And the shadow waiting in the window. Next video. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I made the reckless decision to explore the abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. We had all grown up hearing the rumors, stories of strange figures lurking in the shadows, eerie whispers in the dead of night, and the occasional passerby claiming to see glowing eyes peering from the broken windows. But curiosity always wins. Tristan, Bobby, Sarah, and I thought it would be fun to test the legends for ourselves. The factory loomed before us, a decaying beast of steel and stone. Its windows were shattered, its walls lined with rust, and its doors hung from their hinges like gaping mouths frozen in silent screams. As we stepped closer, the wind moaned through the structure, as if the building itself was warning us to turn back. We ignored it. Squeezing through a gap in the fence, we switched on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the suffocating darkness. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally in the vast emptiness, making the place feel even more alive, like it was breathing around us. "Let's check out the elevator shaft," Tristan suggested. Tristan was always the fearless one. Or maybe just the dumbest. Either way, we followed him through the twisting corridors, our lights bouncing off rusted machinery and long-forgotten debris. When we reached the shaft, Tristan peered down into the void. "I think I see something," he whispered. I leaned in, my breath catching. For the briefest moment, I swore I saw it too, a shape shifting in the darkness, like a person standing at the bottom. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "Probably just a trick of the light," I muttered, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Bobby snorted. "You guys are getting worked up over nothing. There's no such thing as ghosts." We continued exploring, moving through different rooms, climbing up rickety staircases, and stepping over broken glass. The air was thick with dust and decay, every step sending echoes spiraling through the halls. Then Bobby stopped short. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all froze. A faint rustling sound. Something was moving. "It's probably just rats," Sarah said, but her voice wavered. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't rats. A few rooms later, we stumbled upon a makeshift camp, old blankets, empty cans, and the charred remains of a fire pit. "Looks like someone's been living here," I said uneasily. "Maybe it's just a homeless guy," Tristan offered. "That would explain the noises. Maybe even the figure in the elevator shaft." That was the most logical explanation. But logic had no place in that factory. We turned to leave. That's when Bobby's voice dropped to a whisper. "There," he pointed. A shadow flickered across the hallway ahead. It moved fast, too fast, like a blur at the edge of our vision. "Did you see that?" Bobby's face had gone pale. "There's someone here," I whispered. The silence was deafening. Then Sarah gasped. We turned. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs stretched longer than they should have been. And its eyes, God, its eyes, glowed with an unnatural, piercing light. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Tristan's voice broke through the stillness. "Run!" We turned and bolted, sprinting through the corridors, crashing into walls, knocking over rusted debris. The thing followed, its footsteps eerily light, too quick, too fluid. We hit the stairs two at a time, the exit finally in sight. I dared a glance back. It was still there. Watching. Not chasing. Just watching. We burst through the entrance, nearly tripping over ourselves as we stumbled into the night air. None of us stopped running until we reached the main road, the glow of streetlights finally breaking the grip of the darkness. Panting, we doubled over, trying to process what had just happened. Maybe it was just a person, I said, but the words felt hollow. No person moved like that. No person had eyes like that. Bobby shook his head. I don't think it was. Tristan, usually so cocky, was silent. Sarah hugged herself, her voice barely above a whisper. We shouldn't have gone there. And she was right. That place wasn't abandoned. Not really. Years have passed, but I still think about that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel that same sensation, that cold, creeping feeling of being watched. And every now and then, in the corners of my vision, I catch glimpses of something. Something tall. Something waiting. Some places are meant to be left alone. And some things should never be seen. Next video. It was a dark and stormy night. Rain pounded against the windows of the old, creaking hotel where I worked the night shift. My name is Alex, and I was the lone night receptionist at the Moonlight Inn. The hotel had seen better days, faded carpets, peeling wallpaper, and the faint scent of something damp always lingering in the air. It wasn't the kind of place people stayed for long. That night, only a handful of guests occupied the rooms, all of them presumably asleep. The lobby was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional groan of the wind outside. Then, the front door creaked open. I looked up. A man stood in the doorway. He was drenched, water dripping from his long, dark coat. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his piercing eyes locked onto mine. Something about him made my stomach tighten. Good evening, I said, keeping my voice steady. How can I help you? The man stepped forward, leaving a trail of rainwater in his wake. He reached into his coat and pulled out a wallet, placing it on the counter. I need a room, he said, his voice a low rasp. A chill ran down my spine. Of course, I replied, forcing a polite smile. Do you have a reservation? No, his tone was sharp. Impatient. But I need a room. Now. His clothes looked expensive, but outdated, like something out of an old film. And there was something else, something oddly familiar about his face, though I couldn't place it. I'll need to see some ID, I said, gripping my pen a little tighter. A hesitation. Then, reluctantly, he handed me his driver's license. Jack Harrison. I barely glanced at the details before returning it to him. His hands were trembling slightly as he took it back. Room 13 is available, I said, sliding a key across the desk. He took it without another word and disappeared down the dimly lit hallway. I exhaled, trying to shake the uneasy feeling settling in my gut. The hours dragged on. The rain continued to hammer against the building, and the wind howled through the cracks in the windows. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to Jack Harrison. Something wasn't right. On a whim, I typed his name into a search engine. And then my blood ran cold. A news article popped up, dated years ago. Jack Harrison. Wanted for a series of violent crimes. Disappeared without a trace. The police had never found him. My fingers hovered over the phone. My heart pounded in my ears. Then I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, but mine shook as I explained the situation. Stay where you are, they instructed. Officers are on the way. I hung up, my hands clammy. Then I listened. Silence. Not a single creak from the hallway. Not a footstep. Not a door closing. It was as if he had never checked in at all. Minutes stretched into eternity until the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the rain-soaked parking lot. 2 officers entered the lobby, their expressions serious. Where is he? One of them asked. I swallowed hard. Room 13. They nodded and moved quickly down the hall, their boots heavy against the old wooden floor. I followed at a distance, my breath shallow. One of the officers knocked. "Mr. Harrison, this is the police. We need to speak with you." No response. They knocked again, harder this time. "Jack Harrison, open the door." Nothing. The officer turned to me. "Do you have a master key?" Hands trembling, I fished it from my pocket and handed it over. The officer unlocked the door and pushed it open. Darkness. He flicked on the light. The bed was untouched. The room was empty. No suitcase. No wet footprints. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The window was open, rain blowing in, soaking the carpet. The officers exchanged a glance before turning back to me. "Are you sure this was the room?" "Yes," I whispered. I gave him the key myself. They searched the room, the hallways, even the security footage. Jack Harrison was nowhere to be found. More unsettling, the footage showed me handing a key to no one. I watched in horror as the recording played back, me standing behind the desk, extending a room key to an empty space. No man in a long coat. No dripping water. No piercing eyes. He had never been there. But I knew what I saw. And I still remember his voice. I still remember his eyes. Some nights, when the rain is heavy, and the wind howls through the hotel's broken windows, I swear I see a shadow in the hallway. A dark figure standing just out of reach. Watching. Waiting. Next video. When I was 16, my mom, my sister Lisa, and I set out on a road trip across the country. Lisa, who was 20 at the time, had spent months planning our route, marking places we wanted to see, and making sure we had everything we needed. It was a long trip, but we were excited, just the three of us, an adventure stretching out ahead of us. We had been driving for days, taking turns behind the wheel, and despite the late hour, we were still alert. The road stretched endlessly before us, empty and dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the headlights. That's when we realized we needed gas. The nearest rest stop was the only one for 200 miles. We had no choice but to stop. The moment we pulled into the lot, something felt wrong. It was eerily quiet, darker than it should have been, even with the dim fluorescent lights flickering above the gas pumps. Unlike other stops along the way, there was no background noise of crickets, no distant hum of the highway. Just silence. A van full of teenagers was already parked near the pumps, struggling to get one to work. A small gray car sat in front of us, two young men standing beside it. The teenagers looked unsettled, whispering amongst themselves. Then, without even trying to get gas, they piled into their van and sped off. Lisa and my mom decided to go inside to use the bathroom while I stayed in the car. That's when I noticed the two men. They weren't talking. They weren't on their phones. They weren't moving. They just stood there, completely still. I watched, waiting for them to turn, to adjust their posture, to do anything. But they remained frozen, like mannequins abandoned in the middle of the night. My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. I glanced toward the rest stop building, willing my mom and Lisa to hurry. Then, as if they had sensed my thoughts, the two men slowly turned their heads toward me. Just their heads. Their bodies remained rigid, but their faces shifted in perfect unison. And that's when I saw their eyes. Or rather, the lack of them. Their eyes were completely black. Not just dark, not just shadowed, voids. A black so deep it felt like looking into nothingness. A pit where light went to die. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't work. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Then my mom and Lisa came sprinting out of the building. I barely had time to process their fear before they yanked the car doors open, jumping in with wide, terrified eyes. "Go," my mom gasped. She didn't have to say it twice. The car roared to life, and we peeled out of the lot, tires screeching against the pavement. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The two men hadn't moved. They just stood there, watching us go, their hollow eyes fixed on our retreating car. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next city. Even then, we sat in the parking lot of a brightly lit gas station, our hands shaking as we tried to piece together what had just happened. Lisa pulled out a map. We searched for the rest stop. It wasn't there. We checked our phones, zooming in on the highway. Nothing. It was like it had never existed. The next morning, we asked around. Locals, truckers, gas station clerks, nobody knew anything about a rest stop on that stretch of road. It was as if we had driven into a place that wasn't meant to be there. A place that wasn't supposed to exist. To this day, we've never seen that rest stop again. But I know what I saw. I know what we all saw. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see those men. Standing perfectly still. Their empty eyes swallowing the light. Next video. Working the night shift as a delivery driver wasn't easy, but it paid the bills. I had gotten used to the eerie stillness of the city after dark, the way the streets emptied and the world seemed to hold its breath. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was a Friday, just past midnight, when I received an order from a part of town I didn't recognize. The address was unfamiliar, tucked away at the end of a long, winding road. It took me longer than usual to find it. When I finally arrived, a chill ran through me. The house stood alone, a towering relic of the past, its walls cracked and peeling. The windows were shattered, their jagged edges catching the moonlight. There were no streetlights. No sounds. Just an overwhelming silence that made my skin crawl. But a job was a job. I parked, grabbed a bag of food, and walked toward the house. The silence felt unnatural, pressing in from all sides. Not even the wind rustled the trees. I knocked. The door creaked open on its own. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. Then, from the darkness within, a voice. "Come in." It was soft, almost a whisper, but something about it made my stomach tighten. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me. The hallway was dim, lit only by a few flickering candles. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of something old, something forgotten. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper inside. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. The voice came from within. "Bring it here." My pulse hammered as I nudged the door open. Darkness swallowed the room, save for a single candle on a table in the corner. Its weak glow cast long, twisting shadows along the walls. I couldn't see much. But I knew I wasn't alone. "Where do you want me to put the food?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Over here," the voice replied. "Closer now." "Too close." I stepped forward, setting the bag down. Then I saw her. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall. Thin. Her skin was pale, almost gray, like something that had never felt the warmth of the sun. Her hands were long and bony, fingers twitching slightly. Then she stepped fully into the candlelight. And I felt the breath leave my lungs. Her eyes. Empty. Dark pits, void of light, of life. She smiled. Jagged yellow teeth. "Thank you for bringing the food," she said. Her voice had changed. No longer soft, now raspy, crawling under my skin like ice. "Stay a while, won't you?" I took a step back. I have more deliveries, I stammered. Her smile widened. No. Stay. Her fingers twitched again, stretching toward me. We rarely have visitors. It gets lonely here. I forced myself to stay calm. Sorry, my boss is calling. I have to go, I lied, reaching for my phone. She tilted her head, studying me. Second stretched. Then, she stepped back. Very well, she said. The way she said it made my stomach twist. But you will come back, won't you? The room felt smaller. Colder. Yeah, I lied again. I'll be back. I turned quickly, walking toward the door. Then I heard it. A laugh. Soft at first. Then hollow. Echoing down the hallway, curling around me like a whisper in the dark. I didn't look back. I ran. The moment I reached my car, I threw it into gear and sped down the road, my hands shaking. In the rearview mirror, I saw her. Standing in the doorway. Watching me. Still smiling. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of the city. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something wrong. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. My body went through the motions, but my mind was still back in that house. When I finally got home, exhaustion hit me hard. But sleep didn't come easy. The next day, I told my friends. They laughed. Said I must have imagined it. That I was just tired. But deep down, I knew the truth. I never went back to that part of town again. And I never took another order from that address. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is still, I hear that laugh. Soft. Hollow. Waiting.